moderator, our facilitator this afternoon, Annette Mies. Why don't you give her a big round of applause? Hello, ladies and gentlemen. So, there are people moving into the main conference hall. After all, we're going to touch on a very, very important issue this afternoon, especially as far as this event is concerned. After all, this is a conference whose title includes the name European. This afternoon, we're talking about freedom of the press in Europe 2018. Should we be concerned? Is a reason for concern, question mark. Now, just a few days ago, Reporters Without Borders published its annual statistics. And what are then the main reasons for concern? Europe is becoming a hotspot for journalists, a continent where you have several crises. The situation prevailing in Europe has become exacerbated over the past few years. There is no other region where this has happened to such an extent, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Freedom of speech has been curtailed tremendously. Well, this is the topic that we're going to address this afternoon. We are in a lucky position because we have a number of experts here among us, including a legend, Adam Michnik, a journalistic icon. Now, he knows more than anyone else what it means to stand up for democracy, for freedom, as well as freedom of the press. He was born in 1946 in Warsaw. Early on, he supported the Solidarność movement. In 1980, as early as 1980, he was an advisor of the Solidarność movement. In 1988, he became a member of the coordinating committee supporting Lech Wałęsa. Over the years, he has also been put in prison several times. And in 1991, sorry, says the speaker, in 1989, he founded Gazeta Wyborcza. Now, Gazeta Wyborcza, under his leadership, became the most important liberal medium in Poland. He's going to talk about the current situation prevailing in Poland. We know that the political landscape has changed in Poland as well as in other countries of Central and Eastern Europe. And he's going to explain all these developments to us in his keynote address. Mr. Michnik, you have the floor.
Szanowni Państwo, będę mówił.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to speak Polish, says the speaker. German was a language used by my parents when they wanted me not to understand anything. That's when they spoke German. And I still don't understand anything in German. So thank you very much for this introduction, for these words of introduction. It's an honor and a privilege for me and for my newspaper to take the floor this afternoon. So it's a personal pleasure and privilege for me, as well as a privilege for the newspaper that I represent here. Now, Thomas Jefferson, as you know, is one of the founding fathers of the United States of America, and he talked about freedom of the press early on. He said that an independent press is more important than the government. Well, citizens may be able to function without a government. They may be able to live without a government. Without newspapers, no one could actually live. And that's why the freedom of the press must be defended. All the more so because this is one of the highest freedoms that we have. Now, when we founded our newspaper, we didn't know much about what freedom of the press actually entails. Gazeta Wyborcza was founded by people that were people involved with the opposition movement. It's people that came from the underground, that had been put in prison, that had been politically persecuted, that were marginalized figures. But we knew two things. The first thing we knew was the following. We knew that we would have to embody a mission. Our newspaper was not about making money. That's what we recognized early on. Because money, of course, could be made in some other way as well. The English interpreter is sorry, but there seems to be a problem with the German channel. Okay, so we needed to come up with a business plan. That was also very important for us. Without a business plan, this could not have been a successful mission. So we needed a business plan in order to get started. And we also needed a mission. Without such a mission, business people can only make money, but that is quite cynical. So, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and other freedoms. All of this, of course, is quite important, as well as pluralism, diversity, pluralism, and democracy. All of this needs to be part and parcel of your vision. But there are, of course, also limits as provided for by the criminal code. Now, we lived in a dictatorship for a long time. Our enemy number one was censorship. Censorship curtailed us. It was a straitjacket of sorts. Censorship put an end to many discussions that we wanted to engage in with our citizens. But today, there is no more censorship. We have a new enemy, and that's cacophony. Cacophony is the enemy number one. There is a plethora of voices, especially those that you find online. So it's very important to filter out the right voice to find your way through this information maze. You need to distinguish real news from fake news. You need to filter out hate speech and ignore hate speech and fight hate speech as well. Well, we all know the stories involving the Russian trolls that actually had a major impact on the American elections. The internet, of course, is a double-edged sword, if you like. It's like a knife used to cut bread or to stab someone to death. So it's an instrument that can be put to various uses. And what we're seeing today is that journalists, editors, and many others are facing major problems. There's also a wave of populism that has swept across Europe, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, this wave that was ushered in a few years ago. But you don't just find this wave in Central and Eastern Europe, but also in other countries. Those that have devised this new model, the populists, the populists that have risen to power democratically, well, their ultimate goal is to dismantle democracies, erode democracies. I experienced this for the first time in Belarus, where Alexander Lukashenko rose to power and has done away with many principles, such as tolerance. He has started to curtail various freedoms. Putin emulated Lukashenko, multiplied Lukashenko, did what Lukashenko did in his country, but to a much larger extent. And that's what we're seeing in Russia today. And that's what makes us very, very concerned. This country is clearly moving towards a totalitarian system. The media are facing major restrictions. There's not any type of media pluralism or diversity. There's state-controlled propaganda. And there are very, very few independent media outlets, and those that still exist face major problems. So it's a double whammy, really. There's a monopoly of sorts. There's a new ideology that's holding sway. But basically, what this means is that the Moscow leaders, the Kremlin, well, they want to become like China and want to put into practice a system that's comparable to China. But there's just one obstacle that they're facing. Why is Russia not becoming China? Well, there are too few Chinese living in Russia. In order for the Russians to take over the Chinese system, they would need more Chinese people. In Putin's Russia, you also have some admirers. Kaczynski's Poland, and also Viktor Orban, he's also quite appreciative of what's going on in Russia. But the same holds true for other countries. This wave of populism is like a contagious disease besetting Europe. Just think about what happened back in 1989 on our continent. Well, there was also contagious development or contagious phenomenon. That was freedom back then. And today, what we're seeing is a contagious disease that's spreading all over the world. What we're seeing is that democratic institutions are becoming eroded. Well, we have parliaments, we've got court system, we've got a constitution, but all of this, of course, is losing its significance because Putin and Russia, Putin decides everything, or Viktor and his entourage, or Kaczynski and his supporters, his yes men, those representing the PIS party. It's a hybrid system of sorts. But it, of course, sends out chilling messages to free media. But we should be courageous enough to take counteraction. We should say all that very clearly, that journalists are being killed just because they work as journalists. There is tremendous pressure exerted on journalists these days. There are purges going on that concern the public sector media in Hungary, in Poland. Journalists have been killed just because they work as journalists. Not just in Russia, but also in other countries such as in Malta, in Slovakia, and elsewhere. We've seen waves of imprisonments affecting journalists. In Turkey, for example, a lot of journalists have been put in jail. So these are dangerous developments. What we're seeing is that public broadcasters face considerable pressure, including Western democracies such as Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. All of this, of course, should give us pause. These are alarming developments. This is a violation of fundamental European values. Just look at the way our democracies have evolved over the years. Just think about what's been going on in Russia, in Hungary, in Poland. What we have been observing here is cannibalism. Well, we've got developments that should really make us afraid. The winners gobble up the losers. It's like cannibalism. I've addressed this issue on several occasions with my friends living in Moscow, and I asked them, well, what's the current situation prevailing in Moscow? And what they're saying is there is no more politics in Russia. There's just the secret services, the intelligence services, and the same things are going on in Poland right before the elections took place. Now, there were, of course, a lot of times where law enforcement officers came in, where the public prosecutors came in an effort to curtail people's rights. And then, of course, there's this focus on national identity. What Putin is saying is that Russia has risen from the ashes. Kaczynski and Orban are saying the same thing. Hungary has risen from the ashes. Hungary is no longer on its knees. But of course, all of this means that we engage in lies. We're sort of conjuring up the demons of the 1930s again. The demons of fascism, Nazism, and Bolshevism. And we're seeing that these developments have become very, very powerful again, just like back in the 1930s. In Poland, there was a fascist-like organization called ONR, and ONR is still functional, actually. There are demonstrations that are taking place, marches. If you look at them and the way they're staged, you will realize that they're actually quite similar to the marches that took place in the 1930s. Or just think about what's going on in Croatia. In Croatia, too, you can buy Ustasha paraphernalia. The same goes for Italy, too. Now, in Italy, you can buy T-shirts with the image of Mussolini.
There are also some events where people, honor or commemorate people who stood up for Hitler. And this is why these demons are now coming back. So actually, that wasn't to be expected. We're also seeing a lot of racism, a resurgence of racism in Hungary and Slovakia, but also in Poland. So what we are seeing is that all over the place, the independent media are being turned into a tool for global conspiracies. So there's the case of George Soros, for example, in Hungary. There's a conspiracy of the post-communist international. And in our country, in Poland, you see these developments very clearly. But of course, there is resistance out there, and this resistance is incredibly important. It is incredibly important because the European Union, the European community, needs to preserve its free media. And of course, we need to stand up for the freedom of the media, especially in the European Union. In our newspaper, we are also pursuing the same strategy. We are a member of an organization that is called LENA. So this is an organization that brings together a lot of journalists. We also have, for example, members of El País, La República, and others that are part of this organization. And we have set up a think tank on European questions. And the motto of this think tank is the future is now. And there's also a foundation set up by Gazeta Wyborcza. And this foundation is supposed to support the free media in our country. Media at the local level as well as media from abroad. So there is, of course, cause for pessimism, but of course there's also cause for optimism on the other hand. The cause for pessimism is due to this wave of anti-democratic populism here in Europe. But what gives me cause for optimism is the resistance that we can notice against this wave of populism. So nothing has been decided yet. Everything is still open and undecided, so things can still change for the better. My colleague has talked about the struggle against populism and dictatorship. So what I would like to add to this is that we in Poland have actually no reason to be pessimistic. We have to remain optimistic because we in Poland know that, in particular in Poland, populism is considered to be, well, boring, uninteresting. And it is only the optimists that can, well, create people's interests. So long live optimism. Thank you very much. Well, ladies and gentlemen, what a finer statement. We have to remain optimistic. Pessimists are boring. So there's hardly a better introduction to our panel discussion than that. So I'd like to introduce the other discussants, the other panelists. So on my left, please do move closer, please. Doris Akrab. Doris Akrab, I think some of you may be familiar with her. Doris Akrab has been working since 2008 for taz. She was born as a Yugoslav national, a national of Yugoslavia. She grew up in Flörsheim. She met Denis Yücel there when she was still at school. So she's been one of the oldest friends and companions of Denis. So she is quite familiar with the problems of dual citizenship, two passports, and all the discussions that we had about the subject in our country. And last year, she had a very memorable experience. She co-founded the movement Free Denis Yücel, and she helped keep this movement alive. So immediately before Denis Yücel, and for those of you who may not be too familiar with this story, Denis Yücel was a correspondent of the Welt from the Axel Springer publishers. More than 1 year ago, he was arrested when he went voluntarily to the police in order to ask why he had been summoned to appear. So for 1 year, he remained in prison without being formally indicted, and on the 16th of February of this year, he was released from custody on very short notice, and Doris Akrab is going to be able to tell you more about this. This links up with what Mr. Michnik said. She has published a book together with Denis Yücel, and the title of the book is "We're Not Here for Fun," after all. So, to highly recommend it. Then I would like to introduce Michal Howrecki. He was born in 1976. He's from Slovakia, and he lives in Bratislava. He's a writer and translator, an author. He published several books in German. The most recent one has the title Death on the Danube. He is not only here because he's a well-versed writer, editor, and he also writes for Frankfurter Allgemeine and Zeit. And also because he knew Jan Kuciak and he accompanied him in his work. Together with Jan Kuciak, he attended a public demonstration, a protest rally, and they discussed the Panama Papers and the research about the Panama Papers. And he says of himself, my concern about freedom of the press is huge. The greatest danger, as many people in our society reject an open society and hate democracy, well, this is what moves him. And let's start with Mr. Dworecki with something that Adam Michnik has just told us. Optimism is what carries us forward and pessimism is just boring. So how would you rate the situation in Slovakia now after this wave of solidarity after the murder of Jan Kuciak and his girlfriend? Well, thank you very much. Dobry dzień. Thank you for the kind introduction. It's been about 10 or 11 weeks since he was murdered, and there's been a huge protest movement, and that was also cause for optimism in this highly tragic situation. After this shock and the murder of this journalist, there had been many Slovakians, not only in Bratislava, but all over the country, all the way to the Ukrainian border. People were out on the street. There was a very positive grassroots movement organized by very young people, and we actually achieved a lot because Prime Minister Robert Fico, Minister of the Interior, they both resigned. They are still members of parliament, but at the end of May, the head of the police department is also supposed to resign. So those who were actually responsible for this mood of or atmosphere of hatred against the free press. And we are struggling when it comes to the public media. There's a new government that still remains in power, so it's the same government coalition in power in our country. And what they are trying to do now is go the way of Viktor Orban, so the way of Hungary. So they're trying to turn public television and radio into propaganda machinery in order to manipulate people, something that has been working in Hungary perfectly for a couple of years now. And in Hungary, we have to talk about a regime, not a government. So I believe they have a regime now. And the majority of voters only have access to this manipulated news that is tailor-made to the needs of the government. So this murder has now, well, turned into a protest campaign to preserve the freedom of the press. And there's been a public campaign where they're trying to set up, new heads of news channels. We must not let it happen. So I'm quite optimistic myself as well, but I think it takes a lot of courage, a lot of strength, and the struggle is not over by any means. So we're in a phase where a lot of things will be decided, one way or the other. Yes, of course, this struggle is not over. Doris Akrap, when we talk about solidarity, and later we'll talk about the changes of media landscape in the public field. I would like to come back to your experiences with solidarity. So you kept this solidarity campaign alive for more than a year together with your other supporters. Now things are changing because Deniz Yücel is free now. He's at least no longer in Turkey and no longer in jail. And now there is a new campaign that is called Free Them All. Now, what are the things that are changing now? And how can you continue such a campaign and such a movement without having this, lighthouse or this well-known journalist who was actually the person it all was about? I'm not an expert in terms of campaigns, but owing to my long-standing friendship with Deniz, I knew him, I knew what he wrote, so I knew more or less how to produce such a solidarity campaign in order to keep the public interest alive. And of course we did this for 1 year, and some people, well, complete strangers, talked to me because it was in the press basically every day. And even after 2 weeks, people said, well, actually, it's no longer in the news. How are you going to keep this up? When do you think this person is going to be freed? Well, it took a whole year. So all of us, we kept up the pressure for a whole year. It wasn't just me. It wasn't just a little group of friends of Dennis. So we always tried to start new campaigns, reading, a concert, in front of the Brandenburg Gate. So fun activities that included everybody. But to just organize a protest march in front of the Turkish embassy, well, we didn't want to do that because we would have gotten bored ourselves, and we knew Dennis wouldn't have liked that. So we invented a car rally where a lot of people could participate, and this was like a Turkish cliché. Of course, there were some bicycles on board, and you could also run along because the cars went very slowly in this colonnade of cars. But anyway, it wasn't just the action group, and wasn't only the media who participated in our campaign, because without the media, the press, the journals, the magazines reporting on our endeavors, because at some point there wasn't anything to report on because there was no change. So they simply supported our campaign, and then they, Miss Otolu, a second German journalist who wound up in prison in Turkey. So we launched a campaign of journalists who didn't even know these people who were in jail. And then the media magazine that you are the head of also participated. So this campaign, Free Dennis, was awarded the special prize for Journalist of the Year. So it was quite lucky, actually, that the award was discerned, well, 3 days after he had been freed. And not very many people came to the award ceremony because we were still celebrating the fact that he had been freed. So, but we were very pleased about the fact that he won an award. And I thought that maybe, well, the industry looking in on itself. But actually this is really important because these are signals we are sending out. So on the one hand, it's a signal to our own industry, and that is, of course, part of a successful campaign of solidarity. That's the unconditional solidarity. So we need this unconditional solidarity of all journalists. Because if we had said, we don't want to work with the people from Bild, well, actually they were part of the Springer publishers group, but we always said that it is really important that the editors-in-chief should also show their solidarity with Dennis and our campaign, because the sheer size of such a movement is, of course, really important, and it needs to be unconditional, no matter what he wrote, and is he really a good author, a journalist. Actually, he did his job, and that was the basis of our protest. And I believe when it comes to finding an answer to this campaign, Freedom for All, well, actually we invented this hashtag at the time in order to make it clear that it's not only about this one journalist, but it's about the circumstances of the situation in Turkey, or all over the world, actually. So actually that was a bit arrogant of us, but I think it's important for journalists in Germany also to see how quickly you are with one leg in the prison, or with both legs in the prison, and how quickly freedom of the press can be restricted. So 2 years ago we wouldn't have thought it possible that that might affect us as well. Well, we're talking about what we can do through such campaigns in order to change the future. But this is a Congress of Journalists, so I believe that we should maybe lean back a little bit and ask ourselves what role we played in this development. Now let me quote a statement of the former deputy editor-in-chief of a Hungarian paper called Nesčabečka. I apologize for butchering the word. Maton Kogeli. Thank you for correcting me. Anyway, during a recent discussion here in Vienna, he said, we, the journalists, have to think about what we did wrong. That's important. I would like to ask this question of Adam Michnik. You said that this wave of populism is like a contagious disease. Fear is the perfect breeding ground for this. So what have we journalists omitted? What did we do wrong? Why couldn't we take people's fears away? Well, no normal thinking person would ever say that whatever he or she did was okay and they never made any mistakes or committed any sins. So no normal thinking person could ever say that. So we can't say we journalists or us journalists didn't do this or that. In my country there are at least two types of journalists. There's people who are real journalists and other people who are just propaganda tools for the government. So the obligation of a journalist is to write the truth and to defend freedom. The obligation of a propaganda artist is to defend the government and to write what suits the interests of the government. So those are two ways of understanding the task of a journalist. Slovakia is a special case in point, I believe, because Slovakia has a very complicated history and several times it passed the test of democracy. At first when Vladimir Mečiarik lost power, and then after the presidential elections that Prime Minister Fico lost, where Kiska won. And Kiska is now a good president, even though originally he wasn't even a politician. In the Visegrad region, this is the only president who actually uses the language of Václav Havel based on his values. And everywhere else, it is nationalism that prevails. Now, thinking about what we did wrong, thinking about what we failed to do as journalists. And here I'm not talking about the propaganda journalists, but the real journalists. What did we do wrong? Well, maybe we focus too much on Poland, Hungary, or the Czech Republic or Slovakia. Maybe we fail to understand that we are all actually facing very similar challenges. So the machine is the same everywhere. This transition from communism to democracy was quite similar in those various countries, and also the transformation from democracy to this populism, this post-democratic populism. But what's important in this context is that many of us are easily blackmailed. I always call this a patriotic kind of blackmail. So in Poland, you're not allowed to criticize the Catholic Church because the Catholics might not like that. And under the communist regime, the Catholic Church had been persecuted. And of course, you can't refer to anti-Semitism. Actually, it is not so widespread, and people in the US take up what we write, and I wouldn't write about the story with Poland and Ukraine, where the Ukrainians have really injured the Poles But of course, these things go both ways, and each of our nations is suffering from a certain syndrome. We are all innocent victims, and it is always the others, all those around us. They are the ones who bear the blame. So that's a way of creating lots of imbeciles in our societies. Because if every Hungarian, every Czech, every Pole believes in the fact that our entire history has been a history of us being the innocent lambs, well, then we remain people, well, a country of innocent idiots. I would like to ask the same question of Doris Akrab. Actually, Doris Akrab, in spite of all the difficulties that she faced here in Germany, she is still in a very comfortable situation compared to countries such as Poland, Hungary, or Slovakia, with their acute state repression. So, my question to you, since you fought for a certain goal with different media, and you also got a lot of feedback from the audience, from the population at large, did this ever give you pause or made you think about the past, about about what we did? Maybe at some point we didn't really pick up our readers where they are because they're always afraid and they may be overburdened with all of these problems. No, I didn't have that impression, because actually a lot of people really wanted to be part of this movement, and some of you may know some of the texts written by Deniz Yücel. Well, he made reportages and reports from Turkey, which were quite normal, but they were an exception as well, because he went to where it really hurt, and he talked to people that normally people don't like to talk to. So that's something that stood out a little bit in Turkey, that he did all of those things. So of course it's not the whole truth, but it was part of the truth, and he stood out more than other German correspondents before, after him. There's been the case of Kasim Hasim, a correspondent of the Spiegel in Turkey, and he was withdrawn from the country. So we read a lot about this case in Germany, but unfortunately we heard less and less about Turkey itself. So I think that is a problem if you withdraw your correspondent, because he was quite obviously at risk there, even though he was withdrawn much earlier than Deniz was. So he was at risk, and now the Spiegel no longer reported about Turkey, and that, I think, constitutes a problem. Of course, it is now a problem for a newspaper to send a correspondent to such a country after all of the cases that we experienced. So we have to consider this, but I think we need to ask ourselves the question, why don't we do it? What risks should journalists accept? Of course, you can't really send somebody into a war zone without them wanting to go there, or send them to a regime, or a dictatorial regime, or a quasi-dictatorial regime. I think you have to really think about what you're doing as a newspaper. You might even run the risk of losing some readers or subscribers if you say, we'll give up on covering the news from there, we'll just give up on it. I think if you look at the coverage from Turkey, you can see that in the 1990s there were hardly any correspondents from German newspapers in Turkey. Then a number of people were hired who spoke the language. Those were the children of migrants. And of course that's right, because they know about the country and the language, and they follow events there. And now we are faced with a completely new challenge, namely, how far are we going to go with our journalism? What do you mean, how far are we going to take this journalism? Well, what I mean is, let's call him the president. Well, he's still an elected president, so Erdogan. Are we really going to let him tell us that we can't cover certain things in our own newspapers if he doesn't like reading about them? So are we going to accept that? Or shouldn't we find ways and means and my own paper is trying to do something about this. We set up the Taz Gazeta, where 2 journalists who are in exile in Germany are buying those texts from Germany, from young journalists who can't find a job elsewhere because, well, everybody needs to report the news from the government. So there are a couple of small papers that are still independent, but 17 of their staff were in jail, and they're still being indicted, and actually they can't work anymore because they're under a lot of pressure and they're facing 25 years in jail. So still, they are trying to support journalists on site and to report on what's happening there in Germany. But sometimes it is a bit difficult, and without wanting to praise the project, because it's my own paper, I still want to praise the project, after all, because I think that when we're talking about news from abroad, we also need to, in order to come back to the question that was addressed previously, appreciate news coverage abroad, whether we're talking about China or Slovakia or Poland or Turkey. This is incredibly important, and we know this based on our experience in Turkey, and our colleagues are going to confirm this, that if those who are standing in favor of freedom of the press, and if they see that they're doing the right thing and they're not alone, because of course fighting for freedom of the press over there is more difficult than claiming that over here. So I believe that we should not forget to report about these things, and of course we have to run certain risks, and the people on site of course are running these risks on a daily basis. Well, this is a decisive point, but at the same time it's also a very difficult point, because the coverage on the reprisals in the state television or radio in Poland, or the state pressure being put on public media in Slovakia and also in Hungary. Action leads to reaction and vice versa. So sometimes you have the impression that the state institutions, the more they are attacked, the stronger the pushback, and the stronger the pressure on the public media, radio, television, whatever, to give you just one example. So how are you experiencing that in Slovakia? You just addressed it. On the one hand, there's this wave of solidarity, fighting for truth after the murder. And on the other hand, there is increasing pressure on changes in the media landscape.
Now, I don't think that we failed as journalists. Of course, you should always be self-critical. What we underestimated is the social networks, the social media, such as Facebook. Just think about countries like Slovakia, small country, 5.5 million inhabitants, including some minorities. The number of readers or viewers is rather low, so really it's weak media that don't have a lot of money. Now in these countries, of course, Facebook, Twitter, and other social media are very, very successful, have become mainstream media. And then over and above that, of course, you've got conspiracy theories all around, touted by the media and shared by others. I mean, there are a lot of propaganda sites that are basically hate speech sites that have been hate speech sites for 10 years, and the law cannot change it. A private corporation like Facebook is responsible for this. It's responsible for the way the situation has evolved over the years. There's no control, there's no supervision, there's no monitoring, there are no editorial teams. Unfortunately, this strikes a very responsive chord with the consumers. All these conspiracy theories, all these prejudices, people like them because there are a lot of losers in this transformation processes in Eastern Europe. There are a lot of people who make very little money, who live and work in dire situations, and they are not well educated. They can't really distinguish between what's true and what's false. Now, you said Facebook was the enemy who didn't respect or who doesn't respect any rules, but what about the positive impact of all of this? Just remember the positive consequences. I mean, no rules. This also means that opposition media can also carry out their work successfully. But what about fake news that actually propagates 6 times more quickly than authentic news. Well, knowing this, the following question arises: what should we do as journalists in order to catch up? Well, that's really what it's all about, but what this requires is a lot of time and energy, as well as human resources, a lot of staff, and a lot of these small countries don't have that. Just look at the oligarchs, who are also media owners, and they're very powerful, of course, and they often cooperate with the powers that be. It's quite difficult in these circumstances to be independent. In Slovakia, there is a case in point, Nik N, a daily, just like Taz years ago. Well, it's funded by readers' donations, but it's a small medium, a very small medium compared to the conspiracy theorists out there. We're facing major challenges in Slovakia. Well, you're right. There are some positive signals coming out. Just think about the protests, the pro-European, pro-democratic, anti-corruption movements. Well, all of this would have been impossible without social media and Facebook, because everything was organized through these media. But just think about the hatred that's targeted at people. There's so much negative energy, just as much as positive energy. These people are attacked all the time. And it's mind-boggling, the communication that's going on there. Mr. Michnik mentioned Andrzej Kiska. Well, he's a positive example. He's a pro-democratic, pro-European politician. Unfortunately, he has become also the target of a smear campaign. There's a lot of fake news concerning him, and no one can do anything about it. It's a wave that you cannot stop. So I very much admire people, and that's why I am very appreciative of the solidarity among journalists at European level after Kuciak's killing. Well, I admire people who face these daunting challenges, and yet they continue to be journalists. There's a lot of prejudice out there, a lot of hatred, a lot of incitement to hatred. What you should learn is how to deal with this properly. Often people attack you viciously and personally, and I know this from colleagues. It's not easy to work in this part of the world and to voice critical views. Well, we don't have much time left, but we would like to allow 1 or 2 questions from the audience. If you have some questions, please tell us. Please raise your hand so that we can actually answer your questions. Why don't you also identify yourselves? If you don't have a mic, I can repeat what you just said. Or else, wait for the mic, for the roving mic. Thank you. Karl Malik is my name. A question to Mr. Michnik, who I have known for quite a while. Now, Mr. Michnik, you, as a friend and supporter of Lech Walesa, well, in the 80s, in the 1980s, you tried very hard to pave the way towards this revolution, to turn it into an evolution. Now, in Poland, what can you do, what can your media do to usher in an era of democratization again? Mr. Michnik, please. Now, in our newspaper, what we do is we do a lot to make our readers aware what truth is and what the dangers are, the dangers for democracy in our country. Well, this is quite a serious danger that we're talking about, a serious danger facing Poland. What the Kaczynski regime is doing is quite dangerous for Poland at large. Now, just think about the public broadcasters in Poland. There's no more pluralism. These media are owned by the political parties, the ruling party. There's a lot of fake news that they're touting. Joseph Goebbels would be impressed by what's going on in Poland these days. Just watch Polish television. It's really quite unbelievable. I'm talking about the intelligence services, the police authorities, the constitutional court. There is so little diversity and so little pluralism. All of this has been sort of dismantled, eroded, destroyed. These institutions no longer work properly. They're just facades. And that's what we write about all the time. Now, I don't talk about this often because I feel better if I were able to send out positive signals from my country, such as the signals that we sent out for 25 years. Now, of course, the situation has changed dramatically for the worse. Having said this, I believe that we Poles suffer from megalomania a little bit. We think that the fall of communism actually started out or was ushered in Poland. So, with this in mind, we could also say that we could also put an end to this wave of populism. Well, actually, I thought that Austria would be the first, or had already been the first. Just think about the parliamentary or the presidential elections. But then the parliamentary elections took place in Austria, and that meant that Austria is not in such a good situation. Now, I'm a moderate optimist. And I believe that we in Poland, we are in a position to defend historic truths as well as media freedom, as well as the principles of the rule of law. Now, European journalists, they should understand one thing. Well, if you put Hungarian or Polish journalists in prison, you actually put EU journalists in prison, which means that the EU at large should try to defend their rights. Free, independent media should step up, should redouble their efforts. That's one of the underlying principles of the EU. Without this, nothing would work at EU level. You can't just sell off everything. You have to continue to be credible. Now, negotiations are taking place involving EU officials and officials of the Polish government. What's my impression? Well, I think that what the Polish government is trying to do is lie to the EU. And I would like to say to the EU, do not let Polish officials lie to your face. Because these politicians are crooks as well as criminals. Thank you. Well, thank you for this very passionate plea. I would like to put an additional question to you. Now, your publishing house, in particular, is investing loads of money in independent startups that take a very independent approach in this world of digitization in order to combat fake news. How are things working? Because you're also a traditional publishing house. How do you actually promote startups in Poland? Thank you. Well, I've brought my colleague along. Anna, why don't you step up briefly? Why don't you come here and answer this question that was put to you? I'm just like Andrzej Stanov, if you like, and she's the one who actually spearheads our movement.
We have few projects that are somehow promoting new ways of distributing news and distributing different kind of content. And it goes from very typical allies with other media, also sometimes startup media from other countries, not only from Poland. And then, in these allies, we are doing many things from content exchange to exchanging knowledge and exchanging our experience in different fields, in advertising, in sales as well. So this is like the very basic thing we are doing. However, we have also a few editorial projects which are supporting like new kind of thinking, not only in media but also in general in like our country development. So we are showing good cases of future leaders or entrepreneurs, usually very young. Recently, we got even an award, like European award for this project. It's called Jutronauci. It's like about the leaders of the future. And this is already a one-year project, which is actually showing how we can change the future and how actually young people who are like 18 or 19 can do that. And we are paying loads of attention in Gazeta Wyborcza to actually find space, both like in print and online. Presenting, or the people we are promoting, they are also very much involved or interested in designing new strategies for media development, for combating fake news, for finding new solutions for our everyday problems.
Vielen Dank. Es war ein wichtiger Punkt, weil wir oft über westeuropäische Start-ups sprechen, aber manchmal gar nicht so im...
Sorry about the technical problems. It's not the interpreter's fault. There seem to be some technical glitches. All right. So in Eastern Europe, intriguing developments are underway. One final question. Could you please be brief as possible, because we don't have a lot of time left. Wait for the roving mic.
Public TV, I know you and your work from back in the 90s. I was 25 in 1990. Then I started to work as a journalist. In the 90s, I listened to you and I wrote for democracy, for freedom of expression, for freedom of press. In the 2000s, I was listening to you when you came to Bucharest, etc. And I was writing for enhancing democracy, for getting access to EU. Right now, I'm working to pay my mortgage. Anyway, I'm asking you, what would you say for this generation of young journalists, guys who were kids in 1819, at the revolution. They don't know what communist is. They don't know what, from the books, they don't know what lack of freedom means. They know Europe, Euro, no frontiers, etc., and everything seems a fairy tale.
Thank you very much for this question. So, first of all, Adam Michnik, mit der Bitte einer kurzen
Adam Michnik, why don't you briefly answer this question put by the Romanian journalist? Well, you talked about freedom. Well, freedom can only appreciate it if we lose it, and whenever we lose it. Freedom is like air. If there is a lack of air, we suddenly miss the air. I mean, if we walk through the park and if there's a lot of air, we don't really appreciate it. So we are only appreciative of this oxygen whenever we need it. Now, what's been our main learning curve? You can only draw conclusions if you want to go for a learning curve. There is no other way. You have to actually reach out to the young people and talk to them and be very serious about it. We shouldn't impose our views on young people. We should take them seriously. We can't force young people to do anything. We need to answer their questions. So when they listen to me talk about communism, well, they will listen or they might not listen because their experiences are very different. When I was a child, I was very bored. I was extremely bored about many things. about the fact that there was no more Gestapo in Poland, no more people were imprisoned in Poland, no more people were deported to Auschwitz. Well, for me, that was boring. That was just abstract. I couldn't relate to this at all because I was born after World War II. Now, telling young people about communism, this is like a fairy tale for them. It's like fairy tales. Nevertheless, we need to tell those stories. We need to share those fairy tales. Some young people like to listen to them, some don't. It's up to them. We all have embarked on a specific path in our lives. Now, let me just say that Poland is a country in which it doesn't pay off to be very mean. In Poland, what pays off is to be honest. It doesn't pay off to be mean and cynical. Now, when I was discharged from prison a long time ago, well, at the time I was an assistant to a very important and famous Polish writer. And he said to me, well, Adam, if you know too little about what's going on around you, you actually don't know how to behave, what type of behavior to display, and how to respond. And he also said to me, you should continue to be a decent human being. That's the most important yardstick. Now, let me just add at this point that the opinions voiced by young people, well, that's been one of my main drivers in my career. 30% of young Slovaks vote for right-wing extremists. Well, a majority still thinks that prior to the transformation, things were actually better. We have a huge educational issue in Eastern Europe. Teachers get very, very little money. There's hardly any good school, hardly any good university. So there's a brain drain that we are witnessing. Now, why have those protests started after Kuciak's murder, and why have those protests been organized by young people? Well, these are young people who don't want to emigrate. Well, 200,000 people have actually left our country. They want to remain abroad, but what they're seeing is that this is a corrupt country. The freedom of the press has been curtailed and is endangered. There are a lot of dangers lurking out there, and something needs to be done to stop this. There's a problem that we're facing. A lot of people despise democracy, including young people. Well, there are positive examples too. People talk about the 1990s a lot. Well, Vladimir Mečia was an authoritarian quasi-dictator. We had almost become Belarus. Fortunately enough, this didn't pan out. Now we have to actually try to stop this again because the dangers are numerous. Well, the campaign targeted against Denis Yücel has also, or in favor of him, well, has also involved many young people. So these campaigns have been mounted. Doris Akrap will remain with us to give us information. The same goes for Michal Orecki and Adam Michnik. So I hope that we'll be able to continue these discussions after this panel discussion. Now, there's something that really could be considered a motto. What does the Washington Post say? What's its motto? Democracy dies in darkness. That puts it in a nutshell. We should all fight against this darkness. Let me end by repeating what Adam Michnik said. We need to remain optimists. Pessimism is boring. Thank you.